Story 1. The Bell Ringer. It was New Year's Eve in the small, picturesque town of Ravens Hollow. The streets sparkled under strings of golden lights, their warm glow bouncing off the freshly fallen snow. Townsfolk bustled about, preparing for the midnight festivities, their laughter filling the chilly night air. Clara worked at the town's only inn, a charming but creaky building at the edge of the square. She was eager to finish her shift and join her friends for the countdown. Around 10 p.m., while tidying up the front desk, Clara first heard it. A faint melodic ringing of a bell. It wasn't the cheerful jingle of Christmas sleigh bells, but something slower, more deliberate, almost mournful. She paused, her hands mid-motion, listening intently. The sound seemed to come from somewhere just outside the inn. Curious, she stepped to the frosted window and peered out. The street below was empty, the snow undisturbed except for her own footprints from earlier. Shaking her head, she returned to her work, dismissing the sound as her imagination. But the bell rang again, louder this time and closer. The sound followed her as she locked up the inn for the night. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling with unease. "It's just the wind," she whispered to herself. But the explanation felt hollow. As she approached the square, she spotted her friends gathered around the towering clock tower, laughing and sipping hot cider. She jogged to join them, but the bell's toll followed her, growing in intensity. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Her friend Lisa tilted her head. "Hear what?" "The bell," Clara insisted. "It's been ringing for the last 20 minutes. You really don't hear it?" Lisa shook her head, exchanging a concerned glance with the others. As midnight neared, the square filled with townsfolk. The clock tower loomed above, its face glowing faintly in the moonlight. Clara tried to shake off the unease, but her eyes kept darting to the shadows at the edge of the square. The bell tolled again, louder than ever, sending a chill down her spine. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. The crowd chanted, their voices jubilant. Clara's heart pounded as the bell's toll synced with the countdown, each ring reverberating through her chest. 7, 6, 5. Her breath caught in her throat as a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, holding a massive, rusted bell. The figure was cloaked in black, its face obscured. It raised a skeletal hand, pointing directly at Clara. She froze, unable to move or scream. 4, 3, 2. The figure swung the bell, and its final toll drowned out the crowd's cheer. Midnight struck, and Clara's world went dark. When the square emptied, no one noticed her absence until the morning. Her scarf lay near the clock tower, buried in the snow, but Clara herself was gone. The townsfolk searched the surrounding area, but no footprints led away from the square. As the days turned into weeks, whispers began spreading among the villagers. Some claimed to have seen a shadow moving among the trees near the clock tower. Others reported hearing a faint tolling sound late at night when the streets were silent. By the following New Year's Eve, the bell tolled again, louder than ever, just as the first snow began to fall. A young boy walking home from the square was the first to hear it that year. The bell's sound lured him closer to the clock tower, and just like Clara, he was never seen again. Now, the villagers of Ravens Hollow refuse to gather at the square for New Year's Eve. They stay indoors, locking their doors and windows, hoping the sound of the bell doesn't come for them next. Story 2. Frozen in Time. A group of 6 friends had planned their New Year's getaway months in advance, excited to spend the holiday in a remote cabin nestled deep in the snowy mountains. The cabin, surrounded by towering evergreens and thick drifts of snow, was as picturesque as it was isolated. Inside, A roaring fire and strings of fairy lights made the atmosphere cozy and inviting. As the evening wore on, the friends gathered around the fireplace, laughing and sharing stories over hot cocoa and wine. At around 11 p.m., Mark, the group's unofficial leader, suggested they play a game. "How about ghost stories?" he said with a grin. The others groaned, but eventually agreed. Each person took turns telling their scariest tale. The room buzzed with nervous laughter, but as the clock inched closer to midnight, an eerie stillness settled over the cabin. A sudden gust of wind howled through the cracks in the walls, extinguishing the candles. "Must be the storm picking up," said Lily, trying to relight them, but her hands shook. The fire flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. It wasn't until Sarah glanced at the clock that she realized something was wrong. "Why is the clock stuck?" she whispered. The hands had stopped at 11:50 p.m., and no matter how long they stared at it, they didn't move. When the power went out entirely, panic set in. The fireplace, once warm and bright, seemed to dim, and the room grew unnaturally cold. Sarah stood and peered out the window, but all she could see was a wall of swirling snow. "We're snowed in," she whispered. At 11:50 p.m., the first disappearance occurred. Mark excused himself to use the restroom but never came back. His absence went unnoticed at first until Lily, who had gone to check on him, also failed to return. By now, the remaining four were huddled together, fear overtaking the festive mood. When they tried to open the front door, they found it frozen shut. Even the windows were sealed with thick layers of ice. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, the clock hands barely moving. "This can't be real," whispered Sarah, her breath visible in the frigid air. One by one, the friends vanished, leaving no trace behind. By midnight, only Emma remained. The clock struck 12, but instead of moving forward, the hands froze in place. Outside, shadows of her missing friends appeared, etched into the frosted windows, their faces twisted in terror. Emma's scream echoed into the void, swallowed by the storm. By morning, the cabin was found empty, its interior covered in frost. Locals say that the shadows of the missing friends still appear on the cabin walls, frozen in time, waiting for the next group to arrive. Story 3: The Christmas Tree's Curse. Emily loved the traditions of Christmas and New Year's, and nothing embodied the holiday spirit more than her grandmother's antique Christmas tree. Passed down through generations, the tree was unique. Its dark, gnarled branches looked more like skeletal hands than festive greenery, and its ornaments were delicate, glass antiques that seemed to shimmer with their own light. Every year, Emily's family would gather around this tree to celebrate. This year, Emily hosted the family's New Year's Eve party in her cozy, snow-covered home. By early evening, the house was filled with laughter, the aroma of cinnamon and mulled wine, and the faint crackling of the fireplace. Her mother carefully placed the last ornament, a fragile, hand-painted glass sphere, on the highest branch of the tree. The moment it was secured, a faint hum filled the air. "Did anyone hear that?" Emily asked, glancing around the room. Her cousin Tommy frowned. "Hear what?" The others shrugged, dismissing her concern. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this year. As the evening wore on, the humming grew louder. It wasn't constant. It seemed to pulse, in time with the flickering lights on the tree. By 9 p.m., Emily noticed something else. The ornaments weren't just reflecting light, they seemed to glow faintly on their own. Every now and then, she thought she saw movement in the corner of her eye, but whenever she turned to look, the tree was still. "Emily, come join us," her father called from the living room. The family was gathered around, sharing stories and clinking glasses. Reluctantly, Emily sat down, her gaze fixed on the tree. At 10 p.m., the lights flickered, and the hum turned into a low, rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat. The branches of the tree seemed to shiver. "Mom, did you see that?" Emily whispered. Her mother looked at the tree, her brow furrowing. "It's just the wind," she said, though the windows were tightly shut. At 11 p.m., Tommy pointed to the top of the tree. "It's moving," he said, his voice trembling. Everyone turned to look. For a moment, the room was silent. The topmost branch of the tree swayed slightly, almost as if it were alive. Then the humming stopped abruptly, plunging the house into an eerie silence. The family exchanged uneasy glances, but no one wanted to admit their fear. They decided to make an early toast to distract themselves. As the glasses clinked, the tree's ornaments began to tremble. The glass sphere at the top cracked slightly and a faint greenish light seeped from within. "Emily, what's happening?" her mother asked, her voice shaking. Emily didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the tree as its branches began to twist and writhe, reaching out like skeletal fingers. One by one, the ornaments shattered, releasing a strange, whispering sound that filled the room. "Get out of the house!" Emily screamed. But the roots of the tree burst through the floor, blocking the doors and windows. The family was trapped. The tree's glowing sphere split open completely, revealing two glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. The whispers grew louder, turning into a deafening roar. The tree's branches lashed out, wrapping around the furniture and dragging it into the gaping hole that had opened beneath its roots. Emily grabbed Tommy's hand, but the floor gave way, and they were swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, the neighbors found Emily's house eerily quiet. The front door was ajar, and the interior was cold and empty. The tree still stood in the living room, its ornaments intact, as if nothing had happened. But when the neighbors approached it, they swore they could hear faint whispers coming from its branches. The tree remains there to this day, growing taller with each passing year, waiting for its next family.